Hello everyone, I'm Tiffany. It's my pleasure to present you with what I did so far in the Eureka program. I'm very nervous right now and I hope I can present everything clearly to you. Anyway, in today's presentation, I will introduce you to myself and my research and briefly reflect what I learned. Now, I will first introduce you to myself. I'm Tiffany Valentine. I'm now 16 years old, and in the future, I hope to study comparative literature as my major in college. During my spare time, I enjoy a lot of activities from reading, writing to swimming, playing badminton, and traveling. Among them, I think I spend most of my time in reading and traveling. Reading exposes me to characters from various backgrounds, cultures, and perspectives. Sometimes it almost feels like I'm experiencing life through their eyes. I can feel their pain, agony, melancholy, or ecstasy. I enjoy this peculiar conversation with different characters. While reading allows me to meet with different people in different space and time, traveling often pushes me into a completely different setting. I love the way it forces me to walk outside my comfort zone and fully engage with the people surrounding me. I remember the beautiful Hawaiian beach, the skyscrapers in Macau, and the little villages in Guizhou. They are all precious memory for me. Personally, I especially enjoy reading works that focus more on characters' psychological activities. Therefore, my favorite authors are Virginia Woolf, Osamu Dazai and Mishima Yukio from Japan, and Li Bihua from China. After briefly introducing myself and my favorite authors, I will introduce you to my research paper now. As you can see in the cover page, my research topic is the Immitigable tree, Virginia Woolf's inclusive theory of trauma in the waves. I think there are two keywords in this research topic, each representing a reason why I chose this topic. The first is obviously Virginia Woolf, as you can see here. I love her and her masterpieces, namely The Waves. And the second reason is related to the word trauma, as you can see underlined here. Trauma and psychological issues are prevalent in today's society, and I think by studying these topics, we can increase awareness and understanding of the causes, symptoms, and impacts of them. This knowledge would help us to reduce stigma and fosters empathy and support for those experiencing these challenges. In the past, I have conducted research about specific psychological issues and also listened to people who have painful experiences. I think it's always important to stay attentive to them, listen to them. Active listening is always key to understanding. Thus, by studying how trauma is written and represented in literature, I think I can build up a better understanding of those who have been traumatized and are currently experiencing pain. So it's important. I think empathy is always built on and understanding. I think this is also one of the things I learned in empathy exam. Based on these two key words, I come up with this research topic, as you can see here. While the imitable tree basically means the specific symbol that Woolf uses in her writing to convey trauma, which I would probably talk about later in the methodology part. Now, in the third part, research methodology, I will now introduce you to some specific methods I have used throughout my research. It's really hard to classify them into a specific type or category, but I think I can divide my research into several parts so that it's easier to understand. In order to come to the final conclusion, the first part of my research references Carew's definition of trauma. As you can see, she basically divided trauma into two parts. The definition suggests that in order to examine whether an event is considered as a traumatic experience or an instance of trauma, at least two perspectives should be considered. And the first part is the nature of the event itself, which is like whether it's overwhelming, sudden, or catastrophic. And the second part is the participants' responses. So based on this definition, I compare it with the loss of Percival in The Waves. Percival is one of the 7 main characters in The Waves. He was killed by a sudden accident in India, so his death definitely satisfied Carew's measurement of trauma, saying it's supposed to be a somehow sudden event. Before that, he was a beloved friend, peer, schoolmate, leader among the six narrators. And to Neville, who is the focal point of my study, Percival is also a secret crush. Neville develops a romantic love and admiration toward him. And my research will focus on the importance of Percival to Neville and how this exacerbates the traumatic impacts of his death. As you can see here, I have selected some keywords used to describe Percival, such as conventional hero, remote from us all in the pagan universe. Basically, you can imagine Percival as someone who is very heroic. He's supposed to be a heroic youth, but simultaneously, he's also detached from the common crowd while he maintains a really intimate relationship with most narrators. So after discussing the importance of Percival to Neville and the other narrators, I focus on the other aspect of Carew's definition, which is how the participants react to an instance of trauma. In this case, I focus on one of the narrators, Neville, and why his reaction should be considered as being traumatized. So as you can see here, I select a part of the observation made by Neville himself. He initially said that he saw an immitigable apple tree immediately after he heard about Percival's death. And then after he saw this apple tree, he talked about the reaction of the passerby and the woman. He said that the passerbys doesn't really saw the apple tree. They shuffle past the windows as if there were no tree with stiff leaves, which we cannot pass. And this actually suggests that only Neville alone is able to interact and even see the apple tree. And this actually suits the definition of a kind of hallucination. In this part, I references the definition of hallucination offered by psychological organizations, and also I related to Virginia Woolf's personal experiences. So I come up with the conclusion that Neville is likely to experience a very similar symptom of hallucination, like his author, his creator, Virginia Woolf. So as you can see in the first and second part, I references Carew's definition of the waves and the other scholars' opinion and other materials with what is actually happening in the wave, which is basically like an intertwined secondary and primary sources. Through this intertwined academic conversation, I eventually come up with a conclusion. From Neville's perspective, Percival's death should be considered as an instance of trauma. And then I also trace back to Neville's childhood, finding out another instance of trauma earlier than the death of Percival, in which it also goes through a similar procedure in order to prove that it also should be considered as an instance of trauma. And now I'm going to work on another methodology that I use, which is I references different definitions and compare them with Woolf's theory of trauma. Before this part, I have focuses on Carew's definition of trauma and how it fits into the waves, but actually Woolf offers a different theory of trauma compared to Carew's. Carew's definition of trauma focuses on the word experience. As I mentioned before, her definition actually have two components, and one of the components is talking about how trauma should be understood as a catastrophic sudden experience. By experience, we often means we have to physically participate in something. For example, if we search that in Merriam-Webster, we will come up with a similar result. Similarly, in American Psychological Association, trauma is defined as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. These definitions are more narrowed than Woolf's theory of trauma. What Woolf presents to us is an instance very similar to what Carew is talking about. We can see that it's supposed to be a sudden and overwhelming event, though it's not necessarily an experience. Moreover, Neville also shows similar reactions as those who have been traumatized based on Carew's definition. He also suffers severely from hallucinations of the apple tree. While Neville's pain and trauma may seem real to the readers, he is actually excluded from APA's definition and Carew's definition of trauma because he does not physically involved in any of the traumatic experiences. He only heard it through secondary source. For example, in Percival's death, he only heard about the death of Percival, but he does not directly witness the death of Percival. Woolf actually create and construct this character as being traumatized in an indirect way. Her theory of trauma is actually more inclusive than modern theory of trauma. In other words, What Woolf is trying to tell us is that trauma does not have to be a direct experience. It can be indirect as well. It can be something that happens in our daily life instead of limit trauma into a physical experience. I think this is really important because if we have a really narrowed definition of trauma, it sometimes hinders us from truly understand people who are feeling pain. Those who have really experienced trauma through an indirect reference may be ignored by the society. Throughout my research progress, I really want to thank my instructor, Professor Raskolnikov, for helping me so much. I think she really do give me a lot of effort and help. And I really cannot list all of them because it's countless. I'll talk about something that I feel deeply about. So the first is the empathy exam and the pen skill. I love these two pieces of writing and I think it just broaden my horizon and perspectives. Before I read the empathy exam, I always thought like empathy is supposed to be a super good thing because it is a crucial thing that connects me with the character in the book. It is also a crucial thing that connects me with my friends, my family members, even a lot of strangers. However, after reading the empathy exam, I noticed that empathy could be a bad thing as well. If we overuse it to people who does not really need our empathy, it could feel condescending. I think it's really important that we still notice that empathy is still a really good thing, but simultaneously, after reading empathy exams, I always hint at myself, don't be too empathetic. Because sometimes people just don't need those empathy. I think one of the lessons the empathy exams is trying to tell us is that we should always remain a critical view about all things, including empathy. There are bad sides, there are good sides of it. We should look at it critically and think how we should really use empathy. And in the second part, I will discuss how my instructor really involved and helped in my research. As you can see in the first part, she offers me a lot of reading, such as Empathy Exam, Education of the Knife, and also some Emily Dickinson's poem. Moreover, she also gave me a lot of research papers about Virginia Woolf. This is really important because it's so hard to find secondary sources connected to my research. But I have to say, almost 1.5 of the secondary sources included in my research so far is from my instructor, and she really do help me a lot in this part. I cannot really imagine what can I do without those secondary sources because research is supposed to be an academic conversation. You have to put yourself in this conversation mood and you have to talk with different scholars. You have to include those scholars' opinion into your research. But if I don't have those secondary sources, I will not be able to know what those scholars think about the same topic. And the third aspect she helped me is about some grammatical issues. I always recognize that there are certain flaws in my writing and I always need improvement. I really want to thank my instructor for her detailed correction. And I don't often see teachers who are patient enough to correct students' writing in such a detailed way. I think her detailed correction actually gives me energy to work in a better way. The fourth part is, I think, the most important part because it really do elevates my research into the next level. Before I talked about her specifically about my first draft, I was still a bit confused about my research. I always think about the question, what is something new that I can bring in this research paper? But after talking with her, I think she just points out the correct pause for me. She told me that I actually points out a sharp difference between Virginia Woolf's theory of trauma and Carew's theory of trauma. This is something I have never thought about. I didn't even notice myself doing that. And this is actually something very original. So I really want to thank her for pointing out such a direction for my research paper. I think this is one of the most important things that is lacked in my research before she talked to me. And there are also many other small parts she helped me. So I really want to thank my instructor. Despite being helped by my instructor, there are still many challenges I have to face myself. And the first one, I have talked about that a little bit in the previous part, which is a lack of secondary sources. The focal point of my research is The Waste by Virginia Woolf. And most scholars, when they discuss this work, their focus is on stream of consciousness and different symbols used in the text, but most of them doesn't necessarily connect it with the experience of trauma. And only probably 1 out of 10 scholars will discuss the death of Percival, which make my research on secondary sources especially hard. And the second challenge is language. As I said before, I'm not a perfect writer and there's always a lot of space for me to improve. And I really want to thank my writing instructor and my academic instructor for helping me to correct my writing. And the third part is an analysis part. I think it's especially hard to analyze Virginia Woolf's work because her work is strain of consciousness. It's full of symbols. Virginia Woolf's work contain more symbols than most authors. And I think it's really hard for you to come up with the right evidence to support the right arguments. I remember when I'm searching for Percival's important to Neville, I have searched through hundreds of pages in order to find out the right symbol to talk about. And even after I find out the right symbol, it's very hard for me to find the right passages and the right sentences describing it. So it's really a hard process of selection, evaluation, and selection and evaluation over and over again. But I think that's what makes this research really interesting and valuable because Woolf is a very great and also brilliant author, but her work and her piece is not that easy to decipher. There are layers of symbols and you have to decipher each of them. There is always space to improve. There is always more to discover. I'm so grateful that I'm given the chance to read Woolf again, read The Wave again in this research project, and I'll definitely read that again because it's so interesting. I think it's a really precious experience. It's a challenge for sure, and it definitely puts limitation into my research. But it's also a good thing because by now I think I have a clear understanding about Woolf and I would love to know more about her. There are several biggest takeaways in this research project. I think throughout this research I have learned many things, and one of them, very specifically, is the definition of trauma for sure. At the beginning of the research, I think unlike many others who have a narrow definition of trauma, personally I think I have a broad definition of trauma, which is too ambiguous and is also not good. I remember the first time I discussed the definition of trauma with my instructor. I remember she tells me that trauma is not supposed to be something that ordinary. It's very serious and it's not like simple pain and sadness. I think it's really important because before she told me that, and I used to thought that trauma could happen very frequently. After this study, and also with the help of my instructor, I think I now have a more clear understanding about what is trauma, though the definition and the limitation, the boundary of trauma is still a bit unclear. I think it's much better than at the first time I approached this topic. I think it's not good if we give trauma a too narrow definition, but on the other hand, it's also not good if we give trauma a very broad definition, because that means those who have not been traumatized is also able to exploit the resources society give to those who have been traumatized, which is also unfair. Personally, I believe there is always a lot of work needed to be done in the field of trauma in order to give it a clear boundary. And the second part, also as I said in the previous challenges part, I really want to thank Eureka program for giving me the chance to study Woolf and study the waves specifically. I think this is a precious experience. The biggest takeaway is that I learned more about how to do a comparative literature study. Before I have participated in this program, I don't really know how to write a literary research paper. And I really want to thank Eureka program as well for giving me the chance to participate in this kind of research project so I can know how those research principles can be carried out in reality and become a serious academic research paper. I think this is one of the most valuable takeaway, and I will definitely use what I learned in these lessons into my future research papers for sure. Thank you for listening so far. I hope I summarized everything very clearly.